Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. I hope you all are well. And today we begin with a question that may sound simple at first, but carries enormous global significance. Because imagine a world where two powerful nations, the United States and China, are not fighting a traditional war, yet are competing in ways that influence technology, global trade, military strategy, and even the future of international leadership. And while there are no battlefields filled with soldiers facing each other directly, there is still a constant tension shaping decisions in Washington and Beijing, and every move made by these two countries is carefully observed by governments, economists, and analysts around the world, because the outcome of this rivalry could define the direction of the global system for decades to come.
Yes, Adam, and that is exactly why this topic is so important for English learners who want to understand global news in a deeper and more meaningful way. Because the relationship between the United States and China is not just about two countries disagreeing on certain issues, but about two different systems, two economic giants, and two visions of global leadership interacting in complex and sometimes competitive ways. And when people compare this situation to the Cold War, they are referring to a historical period when the world was divided between two powerful rivals. Yet today's situation is more interconnected, more economically dependent, and more technologically advanced, which makes it both similar and very different at the same time.
I strongly believe that understanding this comparison helps us see why so many experts are asking whether we are entering what some call Cold War 2.0. Because during the original Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global influence without direct large-scale conflict. And today, we see the United States and China engaging in a different kind of competition, one that involves trade agreements, technological innovation, supply chains, and strategic partnerships. And in my opinion, what makes this situation unique is that both countries are deeply connected through the global economy, meaning that competition and cooperation exist at the same time, creating a very complex and sometimes confusing global environment.
I completely agree, Adam, and I would add that what makes this modern rivalry even more interesting is the role of technology and economic power. Because unlike the past where military strength and ideology were the main factors, today we see competition in areas like artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, and digital infrastructure. And China has rapidly developed its capabilities in these areas while the United States continues to lead in innovation and global influence. And when both countries invest heavily in these sectors, they are not only competing for economic success, but also for long-term strategic advantage, which is why this rivalry is often described as a battle for the future rather than a conflict of the past.
Exactly, Julia. And that is why we want our listeners to think carefully about this topic. Because what we are witnessing is not a simple conflict where one side wins and the other loses, but a dynamic and evolving relationship where decisions made today can have long-lasting effects on global stability, economic growth, and international cooperation. And in many ways, this situation challenges the traditional idea of rivalry. Because even as these two countries compete, they also depend on each other in areas such as trade, investment, and global supply chains, which means that any major change in their relationship can affect millions of people across different countries and regions.
And it is important to note, Adam, that this competition is not happening in isolation, because other countries are also involved in different ways, either by forming partnerships, adjusting their economic strategies, or responding to the shifting balance of power. And when we look at regions like Asia, Europe, and even the Middle East, we can see how the relationship between the United States and China influences decisions related to trade agreements, security policies, and technological development, which shows that this is not just a bilateral issue, but a global phenomenon that affects the entire international system.
Yes, Julia. And as we explore this topic further, one key question remains at the center of our discussion, which is whether this growing tension should truly be described as a new Cold War, or whether it represents a completely different kind of global competition that reflects the realities of the modern world. And in my opinion, the answer is not simple, Because while there are clear similarities such as rivalry and competition for influence, there are also major differences such as economic interdependence and global connectivity, which make today's situation more complex and less predictable than the past.
I completely share that view, Adam. And I would also say that for students learning English, this topic offers a valuable opportunity to understand how global events are analysed and discussed in an international context. Because when we break down this issue into smaller parts, such as economics, technology, and politics, it becomes easier to see how different factors interact and influence each other. And by following this discussion, listeners can not only improve their English listening skills, but also develop a deeper understanding of how major global decisions are made and how they affect everyday life.
So, dear listeners, as we move forward in this episode, we invite you to think critically about what you hear and consider the different perspectives that shape this debate. Because our goal is not to tell you what to think, but to provide you with the knowledge and tools needed to understand this complex topic. And as always, we encourage you to engage with us by liking this video, subscribing to the English Globe, and sharing your thoughts in the comments, because your ideas and opinions help us create better content and build a global community of learners who are interested in both language and real-world issues.
And before we continue, Adam, let us return to the central question that guides this entire episode. Because as we look at the growing competition between the United States and China, we must ask ourselves whether we are witnessing history repeating itself in the form of a new Cold War, or whether we are entering a completely new era of global interaction where competition and cooperation exist side by side. And by the end of this discussion, our listeners will have a clearer understanding of this important issue, allowing them to follow global developments with greater confidence, awareness, and critical thinking skills.
To truly understand the current discussion about whether the relationship between the United States and China can be described as a new Cold War, we first need to go back in time and explore what the original Cold War actually was. Because without that historical foundation, it becomes very difficult to recognize similarities or differences. And when we examine the period after the Second World War, we see that two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged with very different political systems, economic models, and visions for the future of the world, which created a long period of tension, competition, and strategic rivalry that shaped international relations for decades.
Yes, Adam. And what makes the Cold War such a unique period in history is that even though these two powerful nations were in constant opposition, they never engaged in a direct, large-scale military conflict against each other, which is why it was called a Cold War rather than a hot war. Because instead of open battles between their armies, the conflict was expressed through political pressure, economic competition, propaganda, and indirect confrontations in different parts of the world, creating a situation where the threat of war was always present but never fully realized on a global battlefield.
One of the most important aspects of the Cold War was the ideological conflict between the two sides. Because the United States promoted a system based on capitalism, democracy, and individual freedoms, while the Soviet Union supported a system based on socialism and centralized control. And this difference in ideology was not just an internal matter for each country, but something they actively tried to spread and defend across the world, leading to a global competition for influence where countries were often encouraged or pressured to align with one side or the other.
That is absolutely correct, Adam. And this competition for global influence meant that the Cold War extended far beyond the borders of the United States and the Soviet Union, because both sides formed alliances and partnerships with other countries, creating blocs that supported their political and economic systems, and as a result, regions such as Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America became important arenas where influence was contested, and decisions made in these regions were often shaped by the broader rivalry between the two superpowers.
Another key feature of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race, which was a period of intense competition to develop and maintain powerful nuclear weapons, because both the United States and the Soviet Union believed that having a strong nuclear arsenal would deter the other side from launching an attack. And while this created a dangerous situation where the possibility of global destruction was always present, it also led to a balance of power where both sides avoided direct conflict out of fear of mutual destruction, a concept often referred to as deterrence.
In addition to the nuclear arms race, Adam, there was also the famous space race, which became a symbol of technological and scientific competition between the two superpowers, because achievements in space exploration were seen as evidence of national strength and innovation. And when the Soviet Union launched the first satellite and later sent the first human into space, it created a sense of urgency in the United States to respond with its own advancements, eventually leading to major milestones, such as the moon landing, which demonstrated how competition could drive rapid progress in science and technology.
At the same time, it is important to understand that while the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct war, they were involved in what are known as proxy conflicts, which were indirect confrontations where each side supported different countries or groups in regional conflicts. And these proxy wars allowed the superpowers to compete for influence without facing each other directly. But they still had serious consequences for the countries involved, often leading to long-lasting instability and human suffering.
Yes, Adam. And these proxy conflicts clearly show how the Cold War affected different parts of the world, because countries became battlegrounds for larger geopolitical struggles, and in many cases local issues were influenced or intensified by the involvement of external powers, which makes it clear that even though the Cold War was described as cold, it still had very real and sometimes devastating effects on people's lives in various regions.
When we bring all these elements together, including ideological differences, global influence, nuclear deterrence, technological competition, and proxy conflicts, we begin to see why the Cold War is considered one of the most complex and significant periods in modern history. Because it was not defined by a single event or type of conflict, but by a continuous state of tension and rivalry that influenced nearly every aspect of international relations for more than 4 decades.
And this is exactly why, Adam, people today often use the term Cold War when discussing modern tensions between major powers, because they recognize similar patterns of competition and strategic positioning, even though the context has changed. And when we compare the past with the present, it becomes important to carefully examine both the similarities and the differences, so that we do not oversimplify the situation or misunderstand the nature of current global dynamics.
In my opinion, understanding the original Cold War allows us to approach today's global situation with greater clarity, because it helps us identify which elements of rivalry are repeating and which are entirely new. And while history does not repeat itself in exactly the same way, it often provides valuable lessons about how competition between powerful nations can evolve and how it can impact the rest of the world.
I completely agree, Adam. And as we continue this episode, our listeners should keep this historical background in mind, because it will help them better understand the discussion about whether the current relationship between the United States and China represents a new version of the Cold War or a different kind of global competition altogether. And by building this foundation, we can now move forward with a clearer perspective on the challenges and opportunities that define today's international landscape. When we talk about the rise of China as a global power, we are looking at one of the most significant economic transformations in modern history, because only a few decades ago, China was still considered a developing country with limited global influence. Yet, through a combination of long-term planning, economic reforms, and strategic openness to global trade, it has managed to grow into the world's second-largest economy. And this rapid development has not only lifted millions of people out of poverty, but also positioned China as a central player in international markets, making it impossible to discuss global economics today without considering its role and influence.
I completely agree, Julia. And what makes China's growth especially important is the way it has built its strength through manufacturing and trade. Because over the years, China became known as the factory of the world. producing a wide range of goods from basic consumer products to advanced electronics. And by focusing on large-scale production, efficient supply chains, and competitive pricing, China attracted companies and investors from all over the world, which allowed it to integrate deeply into the global economy while also developing its own industrial capabilities and strengthening its position as a key exporter.
Yes, Adam, and another important factor behind China's rise is its ability to adapt and evolve its economic strategy over time. Because in the early stages, the focus was mainly on low-cost manufacturing and exports. But as the economy grew, China began investing more in innovation, education, and technology, which helped it move up the value chain and compete in more advanced industries. And today we see Chinese companies playing important roles in areas such as telecommunications, renewable energy, and digital platforms, showing that the country is no longer just a producer of goods, but also a creator of technology and ideas.
That is a very important point, Julia, and we should also highlight China's role in global supply chains, because many of the products used around the world depend on components or materials that come from China. And this level of integration means that disruptions in China's economy can have immediate effects on global production and trade, as we have seen in recent years when supply chain challenges impacted industries ranging from electronics to automotive manufacturing. And this interconnected system shows how deeply China is embedded in the global economic structure.
Absolutely, Adam. And this deep integration into global supply chains also gives China a certain level of influence, because countries and companies rely on its production capacity and infrastructure, which creates a situation where economic decisions made in China can have global consequences. And at the same time, China has been working to strengthen its own domestic market, reducing its dependence on exports while still maintaining its position as a major trading partner for many nations, which reflects a balanced and strategic approach to long-term economic stability.
Another key element of China's rise is its growing presence in global investment and infrastructure development, because through major initiatives and partnerships, China has invested in ports, railways, highways, and energy projects in different parts of the world, and these investments are not only economic in nature but also strategic, as they help improve connectivity, facilitate trade, and strengthen relationships with other countries. And by building this network of infrastructure, China is expanding its influence beyond its borders in a way that shapes regional and global development patterns.
Yes, Adam. And one of the most discussed aspects of China's global strategy is its focus on long-term planning, because unlike short-term economic cycles, many of its projects and policies are designed with decades in mind, which allows it to gradually build capacity, strengthen partnerships, and position itself as a reliable economic partner. And this long-term vision is particularly visible in its investments in infrastructure and trade routes, which aim to connect different regions and create new opportunities for economic cooperation and growth.
At the same time, Julia, we cannot ignore China's ambitions in technology, because in today's world, technological leadership is closely linked to economic and strategic power. And China has been investing heavily in areas such as artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, and digital infrastructure. And by developing its own capabilities in these fields, it is not only reducing dependence on foreign technology, but also competing directly with other leading economies, which adds another layer to the global competition we are discussing in this episode.
I completely agree, Adam. And this technological development is changing how the world views China, because it is no longer seen only as a manufacturing hub, but also as a serious competitor in innovation and research. And when we look at global trends, we can see that many countries are now paying close attention to China's progress in these areas, adjusting their own policies and strategies in response, which shows how one country's development can influence decisions at a global level.
In my opinion, all these factors together, including economic growth, manufacturing strength, global trade, supply chain integration, investment in infrastructure, and technological advancement, explain why China has become such an important player on the world stage, and this rise has naturally led to increased competition with other major powers, particularly the United States, which has traditionally held a leading position in many of these areas. And as a result, the global balance of power is gradually shifting in ways that create both opportunities and challenges.
And this shift in the global balance is exactly why the rise of China is often discussed in the context of international competition. Because when a country grows so rapidly and expands its influence across multiple sectors, it changes the dynamics of global politics and economics, and other nations must respond by adjusting their strategies, forming new partnerships, or strengthening existing ones, which creates a more complex and interconnected global system where multiple centers of power exist.
So, as we continue our discussion, it is important for our listeners to understand that China's rise is not a sudden event, but the result of decades of planning, investment, and adaptation. And by examining this process carefully, we can better understand why it is now seen as a major competitor on the global stage, and how this development contributes to the broader question we are exploring in this episode about whether the current relationship between the United States and China represents a new form of rivalry similar to the Cold War, or a completely different kind of global interaction shaped by modern realities. When we talk about the rise of China as a global power, it is equally important to understand the position of the United States. Because for many decades, the United States has been seen as the leading global power in terms of economy, military strength, technological innovation, and international influence. And after the Second World War especially, the United States played a central role in shaping global institutions, international trade systems, and security alliances, which means that its leadership has not only been based on power, but also on long-term involvement in global political and economic development.
Yes, Adam. And what makes the position of the United States unique is that its influence is not limited to one region of the world, but extends across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and many other parts of the international system. Because over time, the United States has built strong partnerships and alliances with numerous countries. And these alliances are not only military in nature, but also economic and diplomatic, which allows the United States to maintain a strong global presence and respond to challenges in different parts of the world while still playing a major role in international decision-making.
Another important reason why the United States has maintained global leadership for so long is its economic strength, because it has one of the largest and most advanced economies in the world, supported by strong industries, global financial institutions, and a long tradition of innovation. And many of the world's largest companies and most influential technologies have originated in the United States, which has allowed it to remain at the center of global economic activity, while also attracting investment, talent, and partnerships from different countries and regions.
I completely agree, Adam, and we should also consider the role of the United States in technological development, because leadership in innovation has always been one of its strongest advantages. And from advanced research in science and engineering to the development of new digital technologies, the United States has consistently positioned itself as a country that leads rather than follows, which is why the rapid technological progress of China is now being observed very carefully in Washington, as it represents a new kind of competition that goes beyond traditional economic rivalry.
At the same time, Julia, we cannot ignore the military dimension of global leadership, because the United States has one of the most powerful and technologically advanced military forces in the world. And this strength has allowed it to maintain security partnerships with many countries, provide support in times of crisis, and protect important international trade routes, which means that military power has been an essential part of its global role, not only as a form of defense, but also as a way of maintaining stability in different regions.
Yes, Adam. And this is exactly why the United States is becoming increasingly cautious about the rise of China. Because when a new power grows rapidly in terms of economy, technology, and military capability, it naturally creates questions about future influence and global balance. And from the perspective of the United States, the concern is not only about competition, but also about maintaining stability, ensuring security, and protecting the international system that it helped to build over many decades.
In my opinion, One of the biggest concerns for the United States is the possibility of losing its leading position in certain areas, especially in technology and global trade, because leadership is not only about power but also about influence. And when another country begins to compete strongly in these sectors, it creates pressure to innovate faster, strengthen alliances, and invest more in research and development, which explains why the United States is focusing so much on maintaining its competitive advantages in the modern world.
And what makes this situation even more complex, Adam, is that the relationship between the United States and China is not only competitive, but also interconnected, because both countries are major trading partners and both play important roles in the global economy, which means that decisions made by one side can directly affect the other. And this level of interdependence makes it more difficult to respond to competition in a simple or aggressive way, because cooperation is still necessary in many areas, such as trade, technology, and global stability.
Exactly, Julia, and this is why the United States is trying to maintain its leadership role not only through power, but also through partnerships and cooperation, because strong alliances allow it to share responsibilities, strengthen global stability, and respond more effectively to new challenges. And by working closely with other countries, the United States aims to ensure that it remains an important leader in shaping the future of international relations, even as the global balance of power continues to change.
I completely agree, Adam. And I would also say that from a global perspective, the United States does not simply want to remain powerful, but also wants to remain influential in the areas that define the modern world, such as technology, trade, innovation, and international security. And this is why the rise of China is being observed not only as an economic development, but also as a strategic challenge that requires careful planning and thoughtful responses rather than emotional or immediate reactions.
So when we look at the situation objectively, we can see that the United States is not only reacting to China's rise, but also trying to adapt to a new global environment where leadership is more complex and shared among different powers. And this adaptation includes investing in new technologies, strengthening alliances, improving economic strategies, and maintaining a strong global presence. All of which show that global leadership today requires flexibility as well as strength.
And as we continue our discussion, Adam, it becomes clear that understanding the position of the United States helps us see the bigger picture of global competition. Because when a long-time global leader faces a rapidly rising power, the result is not always direct conflict, but often a long period of strategic competition, careful decision-making, and gradual changes in influence, which is exactly why many people today are asking whether this situation represents a new Cold War or a completely new kind of global rivalry shaped by modern economic and technological realities.
When we analyze the relationship between the United States and China today, one of the most visible and influential aspects is economic competition. Because their rivalry is not limited to politics or military influence, but extends deeply into trade, investment, and technological innovation. And over the past few years, we have seen an increase in tensions between the two countries regarding tariffs, trade agreements, and market access, which has created uncertainty for businesses, investors, and policymakers worldwide. And these trade tensions reflect not only disputes over specific goods or regulations, but also a broader struggle for influence in global economic systems that have been intertwined for decades, showing how modern competition between superpowers often plays out first in the economic arena before any other field.
Yes, Adam. And when we talk about trade tensions, it is important to note that both countries have imposed tariffs and other measures to protect their industries and respond to perceived unfair practices. Because the United States has raised concerns about intellectual property, market access, and technology transfer, while China has responded with its own tariffs and regulatory measures. And this back and forth has created challenges for exporters, manufacturers, and global supply chains, illustrating that in today's interconnected world, even actions taken by two countries can ripple through the international economy, affecting companies, consumers, and trade flows in every region.
Exactly, Julia. And another dimension of economic rivalry is technology. which has become one of the most critical areas of competition between the United States and China. Because both countries recognize that leadership in innovation, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, and digital infrastructure is essential for long-term economic and strategic strength. And this technological competition is not only about developing new products or services, but also about shaping global standards, controlling critical supply chains, and ensuring that each country remains competitive in the industries that will define the future economy.
And Adam, what makes this competition particularly interesting is that despite the rivalry, both countries remain deeply economically connected, because China is a major producer of goods used globally, including components that are essential for American companies, while the United States provides advanced technologies, investment, and expertise that support Chinese development, which creates a complicated situation where competition and dependence exist side by side, and understanding this balance is crucial for interpreting how economic policies, trade negotiations, and technology strategies unfold between these two superpowers.
Yes, Julia, and this interdependence also means that attempts at economic separation, often called decoupling, carry significant risks, because completely isolating one economy from the other would disrupt global supply chains, increase costs for businesses and consumers, and potentially slow innovation. And while both countries are exploring ways to reduce certain dependencies, particularly in critical areas such as semiconductors and artificial intelligence, the reality is that the global economy is so interconnected that any abrupt separation would have consequences far beyond the borders of Washington or Beijing, affecting markets, companies, and households around the world.
Another important point, Adam, is that both countries are investing heavily in research and development to maintain their technological edge, because innovation in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, renewable energy, and next-generation manufacturing is not only economically valuable, but also strategically important. And as a result, the competition extends beyond trade statistics to shaping global technology ecosystems, standards, and intellectual property norms, meaning that each decision taken by either government can influence global innovation trajectories, partnerships, and even regulatory frameworks in other countries.
And Julia, as these economic and technological tensions continue, global markets feel the effects almost immediately, because businesses, investors, and governments adjust strategies based on the latest developments in tariffs, sanctions, trade agreements, and technological regulations, and these adjustments can influence stock prices, commodity flows, and even currency markets, showing that the economic rivalry between the United States and China is not confined to their own countries, but has a ripple effect that can create uncertainty and volatility worldwide, especially for companies that rely on cross-border trade, multinational supply chains, and global consumers.
Yes, Adam. And while the economic competition may appear confrontational at times, it also drives innovation and efficiency, because companies and governments are pushed to invest more in research, infrastructure, and workforce development. And this pressure can accelerate technological advancement, improve productivity, and even create new markets, which demonstrates that economic rivalry, while challenging, can also have positive consequences for global development when managed carefully, highlighting the complexity of this modern economic battlefield.
Another factor to consider is the role of strategic industries, because sectors such as semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, telecommunications, and clean energy are not just commercial markets, but also areas of strategic importance that influence national security, economic resilience, and international influence. And as both countries invest in these sectors, they create a competitive environment where leadership is essential to protect national interests and maintain technological superiority. And this focus on strategic industries underscores the high stakes of economic competition beyond simple trade numbers.
Exactly, Adam. And in addition to strategic industries, both countries are exploring ways to expand their influence through global investment and trade networks. Because by providing financing, infrastructure projects, and access to markets, they can strengthen economic partnerships with other nations, secure supply chains, and create long-term advantages. And these efforts often intersect with the technological competition, because countries that rely on one superpower for technology or investment may find themselves influenced in economic and political decisions, showing how intertwined economic and strategic interests have become in the modern world.
And while these measures are intended to strengthen national positions, they also create challenges for smaller countries and international organizations, because they must navigate a landscape dominated by two competing powers with different rules, standards, and expectations. And decisions made by these nations can influence trade policies, investment flows, and technological development globally, meaning that economic competition between the United States and China is not only bilateral, but also has a multilateral impact that reshapes global markets, industrial trends, and the strategies of other countries.
So, in conclusion, Adam, the economic rivalry between the United States and China is multifaceted, encompassing trade tensions, tariffs, technological innovation, strategic industries, investment networks, and interdependence. And while competition is intense, the relationship is also deeply connected, making the stakes high not only for the two countries, but also for the global economy. And understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone who wants to follow international news, analyze market trends, or comprehend how economic decisions shape both the present and the future of the interconnected world.
As we move into the discussion of military and strategic tensions, it is important to recognize that the United States and China are not only competing economically and technologically, but also in terms of security and military presence, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, because this area has become one of the most important strategic zones in the world, given its trade routes, natural resources, and geopolitical significance, and both nations have increased their military activity, conducting exercises, building bases, and deploying advanced systems, all while trying to project strength and influence without escalating into direct conflict, which requires careful planning, observation, and strategic caution on both sides.
Yes, Adam. And one of the most sensitive issues in this region is Taiwan, because Taiwan is a self-governing island that China considers part of its territory, while the United States maintains informal relations and supports its security. And this situation has created a delicate balance, because both sides are very careful not to trigger a direct confrontation. Yet the presence of military forces, joint exercises, and international attention makes Taiwan a symbol of the larger strategic competition, demonstrating how local issues can reflect global rivalries and the careful navigation required to prevent escalation.
Exactly, Julia, and another factor to consider is the principle of freedom of navigation, which is central to global trade and international law, because the Asia-Pacific region contains major sea lanes that are used for transporting goods, energy resources, and critical materials across the world, and both the United States and China closely monitor these routes while asserting their strategic presence, which sometimes results in naval exercises, patrols, and careful demonstrations of power, all of which are meant to signal capability and resolve while avoiding actions that could lead to direct military conflict.
And Adam, it is also important to highlight that both countries are aware of the catastrophic consequences of a direct military confrontation, which is why much of the activity we observe is calculated, measured, and strategic rather than aggressive, because both sides understand that the global economic system, technological interdependence, and international stability would be severely disrupted if a large-scale conflict were to occur. And this awareness forces them to rely on diplomacy, signaling, and careful military planning to protect their interests without crossing dangerous lines.
Yes, Julia, and this strategic caution extends to military deployments, because while both the United States and China have increased their presence in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and surrounding regions, they often do so in ways that emphasize deterrence rather than direct engagement, such as conducting exercises, monitoring each other's movements, and strengthening alliances, which allows them to assert influence while managing the risk of accidental escalation. And it also sends messages to other countries in the region about the limits and priorities of each power.
Another aspect is that both countries are also investing heavily in modern military capabilities, including naval assets, aircraft, missile systems, and surveillance technologies, because advanced equipment allows them to maintain situational awareness, project power, and respond quickly if necessary. And by carefully demonstrating strength, they signal their commitment to defending interests while avoiding unnecessary confrontations that could escalate into broader conflicts, which requires not only technical capability, but also careful judgment and strategic patience.
And Julia, we should remember that alliances and partnerships play a key role in strategic calculations, because the United States has long-standing security relationships with countries such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, which provide additional layers of deterrence and regional stability, while China is strengthening its influence through economic partnerships and military modernization, which adds complexity to the security landscape and requires both countries to constantly assess risks, plan contingencies, and avoid actions that could inadvertently trigger direct confrontation.
Yes, Adam. And in addition to alliances, diplomacy is central to maintaining stability, because high-level talks, military communications, and multilateral forums provide channels for both sides to address concerns, reduce misunderstandings, and manage tensions, which highlights that while military activity is visible and attention-grabbing, the real work of preventing conflict happens behind the scenes through negotiation, signaling, and careful coordination, emphasizing the cautious approach that both nations take in navigating such a sensitive strategic environment.
Another factor in this strategic competition is intelligence and surveillance, because understanding the capabilities, intentions, and movements of the other side is essential for informed decision-making, and both the United States and China invest heavily in gathering information through satellites, reconnaissance, and cyber capabilities, which allows them to anticipate potential threats, evaluate risks, and develop responses without immediately resorting to force. And this type of preparation demonstrates the importance of planning and patience in modern security strategy.
And Adam, it is also important to highlight that the focus on strategic caution is not only for the two main powers, but also for other countries in the region, because they must navigate the presence of these two influential actors while pursuing their own security, economic development, and diplomatic interests. And this delicate balance requires careful consideration of alliances, partnerships, and regional dynamics, showing that military and strategic competition affects not only the superpowers themselves, but also the broader international system.
Exactly, Julia. And when we combine all these elements, military presence, Taiwan, freedom of navigation, advanced capabilities, alliances, intelligence, and regional influence, it becomes clear that the United States and China are engaged in a high-stakes strategic competition, where the risks of miscalculation are significant, and where careful planning, signaling, and diplomacy are just as important as the deployment of military assets, which demonstrates the complexity and nuance of modern security competition.
So in conclusion, Adam, the military and strategic tensions between the United States and China illustrate a delicate balance, because while both sides aim to assert influence, protect interests, and demonstrate capability, they are also highly aware of the dangers of direct confrontation, and this strategic caution shapes their actions, military planning, and diplomatic engagement, which is essential for understanding how global security is maintained in a world where powerful nations compete closely, yet avoid open warfare. And this understanding helps our listeners see why modern rivalries are often managed through careful calculation rather than immediate conflict.
When we examine the broader dynamics of the United States and China, it is important to understand that their competition is not only about economics, trade, or military power, but also about ideology and the way each country projects influence around the world. Because the two nations operate under fundamentally different governance models, which shape their priorities, decision-making, and approach to global affairs. And by comparing these models, we can better understand how they interact with other countries and institutions, and why they are often seen as competing not only for markets or resources, but also for ideas, partnerships, and influence in shaping the international order.
Yes, Adam. And when we talk about governance models, the differences are significant because the United States is a democratic country with a system based on free elections, separation of powers, and individual liberties, while China is a single-party state with centralized control, long-term planning, and a focus on collective stability and economic growth. And these contrasting approaches influence how each country engages with the rest of the world, including trade negotiations, investment strategies, military alliances, and participation in international organizations, creating distinct patterns of influence that are visible in every region where both countries operate.
Exactly, Julia. And the way these countries exercise influence also reflects their values and priorities. Because the United States often promotes principles such as democracy, rule of law, human rights, and open markets when engaging with other countries, while China emphasizes economic development, infrastructure investment, non-interference in domestic affairs, and mutual benefit in its partnerships. And this difference means that other nations may find themselves navigating between these approaches, choosing partners based on their own strategic interests, needs, and political comfort levels.
Yes, Adam. And this ideological contrast is particularly important in developing countries, because these nations are often looking for investment, technology, security support, or infrastructure assistance, and both the United States and China offer opportunities in ways that align with their governance models, which creates a form of competition for influence, because governments must weigh the benefits of economic or security support against the broader expectations or values that each superpower represents, showing that ideology is not always about beliefs, but also about strategic partnerships and practical outcomes in a globalized world.
Another aspect of this competition is the way both countries engage with global institutions, because organizations such as the United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, and regional development banks provide platforms where influence can be exerted through leadership, decision-making, and policy guidance. And by actively participating, funding programs, and shaping rules, both the United States and China demonstrate how institutional engagement is a critical tool for projecting soft power, advancing national interests, and gaining allies around the world.
Exactly, Adam. And we can also observe competition in diplomacy, because both countries invest in bilateral and multilateral relationships, establishing embassies, hosting summits, and participating in regional forums, all of which are opportunities to shape international narratives, build trust, and strengthen partnerships. And this careful engagement shows that influence is not only about power or economic resources, but also about relationships, communication, and strategic presence, which makes the global ideological and diplomatic landscape a key battleground for both countries.
Another important point is that influence often extends beyond government-to-government interactions, because both the United States and China engage with business communities, cultural institutions, universities, media, and civil society, using these channels to shape perceptions, foster collaboration, and create networks of support. And this multidimensional approach means that ideological competition is not limited to formal politics, but also occurs through education, trade, investment, and cultural exchange, which expands the scope of global influence far beyond traditional statecraft.
Yes, Adam. And in many regions, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, we see this competition for partnerships very clearly, because countries are often courted by both the United States and China with offers of infrastructure projects, development assistance, technology investment, and capacity-building programs, and governments in these regions must navigate these offers carefully, deciding which partnerships align best with their long-term goals, economic needs, and political priorities, which highlights how influence has become a strategic resource in the modern world.
It is also important to recognize that influence today is often subtle and multifaceted, because it is not only about forming formal alliances or signing agreements, but also about creating long-term dependencies, shaping international norms, and positioning each country as a reliable partner. And when we analyze these strategies, we see that ideology becomes a tool for soft power, used to demonstrate values, governance competence, and the ability to provide solutions to global challenges, which in turn strengthens credibility and legitimacy on the international stage.
Yes, Adam. And this soft power influence interacts closely with hard power elements, because countries that combine economic strength, military capability, technological leadership, and ideological appeal are better positioned to shape global decisions and norms. And by observing how the United States and China operate in different regions, we can see that influence is both competitive and complementary, affecting trade, security, technology, and diplomatic negotiations in ways that have far-reaching consequences.
So when we put all these factors together, governance models, ideology, global institutions, bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, regional partnerships, and engagement with non-state actors, it becomes clear that influence is a central battleground in the competition between the United States and China, because the ability to shape decisions, attract partners, and project values is just as important as military or economic power, and understanding this helps our listeners see that the rivalry between these two superpowers operates on multiple levels simultaneously, from policy and politics to technology and culture.
In conclusion, Adam, the competition for global influence demonstrates that ideology is not simply about political beliefs, but also about practical strategies, partnerships, and long-term positioning, because both the United States and China use their respective models of governance to engage the world, build networks of support, and create advantages that strengthen their international standing. And for anyone studying global affairs or learning English through current events, this illustrates how power today is multidimensional, combining economics, politics, military strategy, and ideas in a way that shapes the modern world in profound and lasting ways.
As we move into the question that many people are asking today, Julia, we need to consider whether the current competition between the United States and China can truly be called a Cold War 2.0, because at first glance there are some similarities to the original Cold War, especially when we look at rivalry, global influence, and the strategic competition that seems to define much of international relations today. And just like the United States and the Soviet Union decades ago, both nations are vying for influence in multiple regions, engaging in military and technological competition, and projecting power in ways that attract attention from allies, partners, and global observers.
Yes, Adam? And while those similarities are clear, it is equally important to note the differences. Because unlike the United States and the Soviet Union during the original Cold War, the modern world is deeply interconnected through trade, investment, technology, and global institutions. And this economic interdependence means that both countries rely on each other in ways that make a full separation or confrontation extremely difficult, which contrasts sharply with the ideological and economic isolation that characterized the Cold War, and shows that today's rivalry operates in a more complex and globalized environment.
Exactly, Julia. And another important difference is globalization itself. Because today, supply chains, multinational corporations, international trade agreements, and digital connectivity link economies and societies across continents, which creates a situation where competition exists alongside cooperation, and both the United States and China have to navigate a world where aggressive moves could disrupt not only their own economies but also global markets, investments, and technological progress, which is very different from the more rigid division between East and West that defined the original Cold War.
Yes, Adam. And from my perspective, this is why it is not accurate to call the current situation Cold War 2.0, because the old Cold War was heavily ideological, centered on opposing political systems and spheres of influence that rarely interacted economically, while today competition and collaboration coexist, meaning that we cannot fully equate the two situations, and it is more precise to describe the current rivalry as a new type of strategic competition shaped by globalization, technology, and economic integration, rather than purely ideological opposition.
I completely agree, Julia, and yet we cannot ignore the strategic tension and global stakes, because in some ways, the rivalry does resemble a Cold War, in that both countries are competing for influence, forming partnerships, investing in technology and infrastructure, and demonstrating military capability. And this creates pressure on other nations to make strategic choices, just as smaller countries had to navigate alliances during the original Cold War, which shows that some dynamics of competition remain similar even if the context has changed dramatically.
Exactly, Adam. And another way to see this is through global influence, because both countries are actively seeking to shape international norms, engage with multilateral organizations, and secure partnerships in developing regions, which mirrors the competition for influence that defined the Cold War era. But again, the difference is that economic and technological connections mean that the consequences of confrontation would be far more disruptive to the global system than in the past, making the stakes higher but the approach more cautious and strategic.
Yes, Julia, and I would also suggest that the current situation may represent a new type of competition entirely, one that blends elements of rivalry, interdependence, and strategic patience. Because instead of a clear divide between two opposing blocs, we see overlapping networks of cooperation and competition. Where alliances are flexible, trade relationships remain intertwined, and influence is exercised in both visible and subtle ways. And this complexity makes it difficult to label the current US-China relationship with the same terms used for the Cold War decades ago.
And from an educational perspective, Adam, this distinction is important for learners and global observers alike, because understanding that this is not a simple repeat of history encourages critical thinking, analytical reasoning, and careful observation. And by examining both similarities and differences, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of how global power dynamics evolve over time, and how nations adapt to changing economic, technological, and political environments, rather than simply repeating past patterns.
Yes, Julia, and one way to think about it is that the current rivalry is multidimensional, combining elements of economics, technology, military power, diplomacy, and global influence, which makes it more complex than the original Cold War, because competition is not confined to ideological opposition or military confrontation, but instead involves careful balancing of interests, interdependence, and strategic signaling, which requires policymakers, businesses, and analysts to think more holistically and anticipate indirect effects across multiple areas.
And another critical point, Adam, is that the narrative of Cold War 2.0 can sometimes oversimplify the situation, because it emphasizes conflict and confrontation while downplaying cooperation, mutual dependence, and global interconnectedness. And when we approach the topic carefully, we see that today's strategic environment is more fluid, nuanced, and flexible, which is why scholars, analysts, and global leaders often prefer to describe it as a competitive but interdependent relationship, rather than a direct repeat of historical Cold War patterns.
Exactly, Julia. And this approach encourages listeners to think critically about global affairs, because instead of assuming a binary opposition, they can recognize the complexity of modern international relations, the interplay between rivalry and collaboration, and the need for careful observation, strategic patience, and nuanced understanding, which are essential skills for anyone trying to follow global developments, make informed decisions, or analyze the behavior of powerful nations in a connected world.
So in conclusion, Adam, the current situation between the United States and China shares some elements with the Cold War, such as strategic rivalry and competition for influence. But it is also fundamentally different due to globalization, economic interdependence, technological integration, and multilateral engagement. And by understanding these similarities and differences, our listeners can see that the question is not simply whether this is Cold War 2.0, but rather how modern superpowers compete and cooperate in ways that are more complex, interconnected, and nuanced than ever before, which is exactly the type of analysis we aim to provide in this educational podcast.
As we examine the global consequences of the United States and China's competition, it becomes clear that the effects extend far beyond these two countries, because smaller nations, international businesses, and regional organizations all feel the impact of decisions made by these superpowers. And in today's interconnected world, shifts in trade policy, technology access, or strategic alignment can ripple across continents, influencing supply chains, investment flows, and economic stability, which means that understanding this rivalry is not just a matter of observing two nations, but of recognizing how global systems are shaped by their actions.
Yes, Adam. And one of the most visible impacts is on smaller countries, because they often find themselves navigating a complex landscape of economic incentives, security partnerships, and political influence. And when the United States or China offers investment, technology, or diplomatic support, these nations must carefully balance relationships to avoid being caught in the middle of strategic competition, which creates both opportunities and challenges, highlighting how global politics today requires careful calculation, strategic flexibility, and an understanding of broader geopolitical dynamics that may affect national interests.
Exactly, Julia. And when it comes to global trade, the rivalry affects supply chains, tariffs, and investment decisions, because multinational companies must respond to new regulations, trade restrictions, and market uncertainties, which can influence everything from production schedules to pricing and availability of goods worldwide. And as a result, the competition between the United States and China has a direct influence on businesses, consumers, and governments across regions, emphasizing how interconnected the global economy has become and how sensitive it is to actions by these two major powers.
And Adam, technology is another area where the effects are pronounced, because competition in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, 5G, and advanced manufacturing shapes which countries have access to cutting-edge tools and capabilities. And this in turn affects innovation, economic growth, and strategic capabilities worldwide, meaning that nations and companies must carefully monitor developments, adapt to changing standards, and position themselves to benefit from new technologies, all while managing dependencies and potential vulnerabilities in an increasingly competitive and interconnected technological landscape.
Yes, Julia, and we should also consider the broader economic implications, because currency fluctuations, global investment flows, and trade agreements are all influenced by U.S.-China relations. And these changes can affect financial markets, infrastructure projects, and development programs in regions far from Washington or Beijing, which demonstrates that the rivalry is not confined to bilateral issues, but has systemic consequences that influence economic stability, growth prospects, and long-term planning for governments and organizations across the globe.
And Adam, security concerns are also a major global consequence because shifts in military presence, strategic alliances, and regional influence affect stability in multiple regions, particularly in Asia-Pacific, the Middle East, and Africa. And when powerful countries assert influence through naval patrols, arms sales, or military partnerships, smaller nations must navigate risks carefully, invest in their own defense strategies, and consider the implications of external involvement, which underscores the fact that security, economics, and politics are deeply intertwined in today's globalized world.
Another key point is the uncertainty that this rivalry generates, because when superpowers compete economically, technologically, and militarily, it creates unpredictability for policymakers, investors, and even citizens in many countries. And this uncertainty affects long-term planning, infrastructure projects, and international cooperation, which is why analysts emphasize the importance of monitoring global developments carefully, assessing risks, and preparing for multiple scenarios in a world where the actions of one nation can have consequences on the other side of the planet almost immediately.
Yes, Adam. And in this context, cooperation becomes essential because no country, no matter how powerful, can address global challenges alone, and issues such as climate change, pandemics, energy security, and cyber threats require collaboration across borders, regardless of rivalry. And when the United States and China find ways to cooperate or coordinate in areas of mutual interest, they help stabilize global systems, reduce risks, and create opportunities for shared progress, showing that even in times of competition, partnership, and diplomacy remain critical tools for managing complex global challenges.
Exactly, Julia. And when we consider the interconnected nature of the world today, we can see that economic, technological, and security systems are all linked, meaning that disruptions in one area often affect others, and decisions made by the United States or China can influence trade flows, political alignments, technological development, and even social stability in distant countries, which illustrates how global interdependence has transformed the way nations compete, cooperate, and interact in the 21st century.
Yes, Adam. And this also highlights the responsibility of all nations, including superpowers, to act with awareness of these consequences, because the choices made in Washington or Beijing are not isolated. They ripple through international markets, regional security arrangements, technological ecosystems, and diplomatic networks, affecting millions of people and shaping the trajectory of global development in ways that require careful planning, strategic thinking, and long-term vision.
Another important consideration is how global institutions such as the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and regional development banks play a role in mitigating uncertainty, because these organizations provide frameworks for negotiation, dispute resolution, and multilateral cooperation, helping to stabilize the system even when rivalries intensify. And by participating actively in these institutions, nations can create mechanisms for dialogue, transparency, and shared decision-making, which is essential in a world where competition is intense but cooperation is necessary for global stability.
In conclusion, Adam, the competition between the United States and China affects the entire world, influencing smaller countries, global trade, technology access, economic stability, security, and diplomatic relationships. And while the rivalry creates uncertainty, it also highlights the importance of cooperation, strategic awareness, and multilateral engagement. Because the interconnected nature of the modern world means that no nation can operate in isolation. And understanding these dynamics helps our listeners see how local decisions in major powers can have far-reaching consequences for global affairs, making this analysis both educational and practical for anyone interested in international relations.
As we bring this episode to a close, Julia, it is important to reflect on the key lessons that emerge from our discussion of the United States and China's evolving relationship. Because what we have seen is that global politics is deeply shaped by shifts in power. And when two influential nations interact, their decisions ripple across continents, affecting economies, alliances, security, and technology in ways that are impossible to ignore. And understanding these shifts helps us recognize that while competition is inevitable between superpowers, it does not always translate into direct conflict, and careful analysis can reveal opportunities for strategic cooperation even amid rivalry, which is essential for anyone trying to comprehend the complex realities of international relations in the 21st century.
Yes, Adam, and one of the most important insights from today's discussion is that the world has become more connected than ever before, because economic interdependence, technological integration, and global institutions mean that the actions of one country affect many others. And in this context, smaller nations, multinational companies, and regional alliances all play a role in shaping outcomes, which shows that understanding global events is not just a matter of curiosity, but a practical necessity for making informed decisions, assessing risks, and recognizing how strategic choices influence stability, prosperity, and cooperation worldwide.
Exactly, Julia. And when we think about competition and cooperation, it becomes clear that economic ties make the possibility of open conflict far more complicated than in past rivalries, because the United States and China are deeply intertwined through trade, investment, supply chains, and technology, and these connections create both incentives for collaboration and pressures for strategic positioning, which means that policy decisions must be evaluated not only for national benefit, but also for their global impact. And this complexity requires patience, foresight, and a careful balance between asserting national interests and maintaining stability in the international system.
And Adam, another key reflection is that competition itself is not inherently negative, because it can drive innovation, efficiency, and progress, and it pushes nations to invest in research, infrastructure, and human capital, which benefits not only the competitors themselves but also the broader global community. And yet, this competition must be managed carefully, because when rivalry becomes unchecked or confrontational, it can disrupt markets, create security tensions, and destabilize regions, showing that modern international relations require a combination of strategic caution, diplomacy, and long-term planning to ensure that competition remains constructive rather than destructive.
Yes, Julia, and we have also seen that global influence is exercised in many ways, not just through military power or economic might, but also through technology, diplomacy, culture, and soft power. And this multidimensional approach highlights that modern rivalry is complex, involving not only visible confrontations but also subtle forms of persuasion, engagement, and strategic signaling. And understanding these nuances is essential for anyone seeking to interpret international developments accurately, because it shows that competition and cooperation often exist simultaneously, shaping the world in ways that are both tangible and indirect.
Exactly, Adam. And for students and learners of English who are also following global events, this episode demonstrates the importance of connecting language learning with real-world awareness, because engaging with news, strategic analysis, and international affairs not only improves comprehension and critical thinking, but also allows listeners to understand the broader implications of decisions made by powerful nations, which affects global stability, economic growth, technological development, and regional security, emphasizing the value of informed observation in a rapidly changing world.
Another important point, Julia, is that the United States and China are demonstrating that strategic patience, careful planning, and measured actions are essential in a world where rapid globalization, interdependence, and technological integration mean that the consequences of decisions are far-reaching. Because every policy, investment, or military maneuver can influence markets, alliances, and perceptions thousands of miles away, which reinforces the idea that understanding competition and cooperation requires not only knowledge of specific events, but also an awareness of global interconnections, strategic risks, and the ripple effects of national choices.
Yes, Adam, and reflecting on the interconnectedness of today's world, it becomes clear that cooperation is not simply an option, but a necessity in many areas, because global challenges such as energy security, climate change, technological standards, public health, and cybersecurity cannot be solved by a single nation acting alone. And even amid rivalry, collaboration can create solutions that benefit multiple countries, stabilize markets, and prevent conflict, showing that in modern international relations, competition and cooperation are not mutually exclusive, but complementary forces that shape outcomes in complex ways.
And Julia, this brings us to an essential takeaway for our listeners. Understanding the delicate balance between competition and cooperation helps us interpret global developments more accurately, anticipate potential risks, and recognize opportunities for constructive engagement. Because today's superpowers operate in a world where actions are scrutinized internationally, decisions have multidimensional consequences, and strategic choices can either exacerbate tensions or promote stability, which means that careful analysis, critical thinking, and informed dialogue are invaluable tools for navigating a connected and complex world.
Yes, Adam, and in addition, recognizing this balance highlights the agency of smaller countries, international organizations, and private actors. Because even in the context of superpower competition, their decisions, partnerships, and negotiations contribute to shaping global outcomes. And this reinforces the idea that no nation or institution is isolated, and understanding global events requires seeing the interconnections between political power, economic ties, military strategy, and technological development, all of which interact to determine the trajectory of international relations.
Exactly, Julia. And when we step back and consider all the elements we have discussed, economic interdependence, technological competition, military tensions, ideological influence, strategic patience, and multilateral engagement, it becomes clear that the rivalry between the United States and China is both complex and multi-layered, and that the world is being shaped not only by the pursuit of power, but also by the choices nations make regarding collaboration, negotiation, and mutual benefit, which provides an important lesson for students, professionals, and global citizens alike about the importance of context, perspective, and careful observation.
So, Adam, to leave our listeners with a powerful closing thought, while competition between nations is inevitable, the future will not be decided by rivalry alone, but by how countries choose between competition and cooperation, because strategic foresight, careful diplomacy, and mutual understanding have the potential to transform rivalry into opportunities for stability, growth, and shared progress. And by analysing these dynamics carefully, our listeners can not only improve their understanding of English and global affairs, but also develop the ability to think critically about the forces shaping the world today and tomorrow.